we've learned that for the first time ever, New York City has used ranked choice voting in its primary, not only to decide candidates for the mayor's race, but also to create the most diverse city council in New York's history. We'll talk about that. Number two, the Supreme Court ruled that in Arizona, it is acceptable if voters face, and I think I am quoting, I'm at least intending to quote, some disparity in the ability to cast ballots. We'll need to talk about how much exactly some disparity is allowed versus too much disparity. And due to the magic, if we want to call it magic, of redistricting, the Republican Party stands to retake Congress in the 2020 congressional elections, even if they get fewer votes by millions of fewer votes. We're going to talk about all of this with David Daley, who we learned it from. We welcome back to the show to talk about his recent writings in Salon and in The Guardian, also in his recent book, Unrigged, How Americans Are Battling Back to Save Democracy. David, welcome to Democracy Nerd. So I was in New York. It was my first East Coast trip a few weeks ago. And this was in June, as I recall, or was it in June when I was there? I was in June because my birthday happened. And while I was there, I was paying attention to the municipal elections because a friend of mine from law school was running for district attorney in New York, Alvin Bragg, but at the same time, what most people were paying attention to, of course, was the mayor's race. What happened in the mayor's race?
It was really an exciting race. You had ranked choice voting used in New York City for the very first time, and it was extraordinarily useful, right? Because you had 11 candidates running, and you would have had a real possibility of somebody winning essentially the mayor's office with 25% of the vote in the Democratic primary. So you had Eric Adams, who was the Brooklyn borough president, ends up winning, but he won with ranked choice voting, which means voters were able to kind of express their preferences. And you had a series of instant runoffs throughout each of these 8 rounds before it was determined that Adams had the widest and the deepest support. And it was pretty cool.
Traditionally, because city of New York still has partisan races, right? So typically, unless it's Rudy Giuliani or Bloomberg, the winner of the Democratic primary would be thought of to be the winner of the mayor's race. And so the idea is in a crowded congressional primary, if you got 11 candidates, yeah, you might win that congressional primary with 20+% of the vote instead of 30, 40, or much less 50% of the vote. What is the current status? It might be a little bit backing up, but in my lifetime, we've had some Republican mayors. Heck, Lindsay was a mayor of New York when the Republican Party was a very different thing in New York. What's the current status of partisan realities in New York? Is just Republican not as viable now as they were in the 90s and even early 2000s?
I think if you had Giuliani was an interesting figure in that particular moment in New York history. You had crime up and the economy down, and I think New York felt like it probably needed a tough guy coming in, and Giuliani had a good anti-corruption message at the time, which is kind of hard to believe, right? But after his run as U.S. attorney, taking down the mafia, and then Bloomberg after that, I think was able to kind of ride on those coattails of kind of New York coming back after through the tech economy rise of the 1990s, and then you had the attack on the World Trade Center just before Election Day. So I think all of that kind of
on the coattails of that, and $73 million, $73 million,
helps too, right? Expenditures. Exactly. But New York is essentially a one-party city, and the beauty of ranked choice voting there is whenever you have a one-party city, it is really, really hard for new voices, for younger voices to emerge. And what you had, if you look even further on that ballot, if you look down ballot at the city council races, a city council that has been dominated by men for time immemorial is going to have a majority of women for the first time in its history. 26 of those 28 women are women of color. You have the number of new city councilors under the age of 40 is just out of this world. The city council in New York is also going to look like the city for the first time.
And this is interesting. In the debate we've been having and watching and listening to over, I don't know, the years we've been paying attention, and certainly ever since we started doing this show, the question about maybe the principal critique or hypothetical critique of ranked choice voting was one basically around diversity. And itself was potentially sort of a racist argument. It was sort of like, blank voters will be too blank or insufficiently blank in order to be able to participate in blank voting system. Right. And, people fill out the blanks differently, but it was essentially like, oh, you're going to make it too complicated. And if it's complicated, certain groups who aren't all engaged in the process significantly, particularly groups at the fringe, won't be able to engage as much. Now, the spirit of this critique was a good spirit. How do we have a democracy that actually works, doesn't leave people out because it creates sort of a Byzantine labyrinth that people can't solve? But what was the experience as it actually played out, according to your reporting and your observations?
Yeah, there are poll numbers on this, and there was a poll by Edison Research that shows that more than 95% of voters in New York City called ranked choice voting easy, and about 80% of them said that they wanted to go ahead and use it again. So I think that all of those concerns, the idea that it would be too confusing or too time consuming, which, as you say, I think are directly tied to, vile racist tropes, they all proved unfounded.
And it's heartening to me because one of my critiques, and to the extent that I sit in this chair, maybe it's one critique of the show, is that I think it goes deeper and broader. It's inappropriate to say deeper, but it goes beyond even just racism, I will say. And it is this. It is a habit among too much of the consultant class that voters are lazy and stupid. And I think that's linked to people who play in democracy as a mechanism of power and wealth rather than as an exercise in making decisions. And so voters are viewed as, tools to be predated upon, right? They're things to eat. They're things to fool. They're objects to fool. At best, they're products to manipulate and sell. And as distinct from human beings who aren't lazy and stupid. They might be busy. They might be distracted. They might be subject to lots of confusing and intentionally dishonest information, and with too few allies to help them figure things out who aren't, in fact, trying to manipulate them. And all of those things might be true. But to me, it heartens it bolsters my set point. It bolsters my own impression that, no, I think there's a lot of people who are trying to figure this stuff out.
I think that's really smart. I think I agree. You've got a consultant class and also a candidate class that has been running and winning elections a certain way. That's how they know how to do it. So that's how they want to keep doing it. And you have voters that are saying, wait a second, the system isn't working for me. It's not representing me. It's not giving me enough choice. Or in the case of an 11-person field, what am I supposed to do with that if I only have a single choice? Polls are so unreliable. I have no idea if this is a smart vote, if I'm throwing it away, if I'm helping elect the person I like least by doing this. It's actually more confusing to have a single vote system when you've got 11 candidates than it is to have a ranked choice system. I mean, think back to the Democratic primary in 2020, right? We all essentially had in our heads all of these lanes, and we could probably rank our top 7 or 8 candidates. When we go to the store, if our favorite brand of ice cream isn't there, we know what our second choice is. This is not complicated.
We rank all the time, and one of the people we've talked to, and one of our friends, a guy named Mark Frohnmeyer, who's leading the charge. One of the people leading the charge on star voting, which is sort of one way of thinking about it, sort of a souped up version of ranked choice voting. He faced the same critique, and I think your answer is essentially the exact response, even maybe his response. And he'd use, well, people give stars to things all the time. Like I order something online and I give it 3, 4, or 5 stars, whether I, okay with it or, like it a lot, or give it 1 star if I hate it. So I don't think it's that complicated. Any other lessons, anything else that comes out of that people should be aware of? Does this boost momentum to install ranked choice voting in more jurisdictions? Is this fueling the funder landscape who's looking at this? Well, maybe this is a way to, if we've got a Congress that, and particularly, and I want to make it a sort of assume that everything is even there, but we have a Congress that is trying to, we have at least one party in Congress that's really trying to be obstructionist and anti-majoritarian, that maybe this is one way that we can break loggerheads of a partisan system. What are you learning from this?
I think that's right. I think what we are seeing is that ranked choice voting has been embraced, and it's been embraced all over the country. You had Republicans in Virginia using it to select their gubernatorial and other statewide nominees this year. And it is really, really helpful in crowded fields to give voters this extra option and then to build our way towards a consensus, right? It's not that the most centrist a person wins. It's that the candidate that the most people can find a way to agree on wins. And in so many gerrymandered congressional districts, in so many one-party states, where essentially coming out of these low turnout, base-driven primaries is the only way to win, and it's tantamount to election in the fall. When you're able to use ranked choice voting, you open up the process to everybody. It makes representation better.
This is, you said a mouthful, and I mean that not the number of words, but the amount of content. The idea, even my other critique, the critique I had, and I said not the reason I opposed, but where my curiosity still lied, was with, well, would it be a tool primarily, would ranked choice voting primarily be a tool to, or basically, or mainly advantage people who are outside the fringe? And by outside the fringe, that's like, the fringe isn't always a bad place to be, right? The fringe might be where the new idea is. The fringe might be where courage lies. The fringe might be where disrupting a corrupt status quo exists. So, and maybe it'll be just whoever has the biggest budgets and the fewest negatives will be those who win. And what I heard you say is, that might not be the case. Although you didn't say anything exactly about the negatives, but it isn't necessarily the most centrist candidate.
I think that's right. What I think is good about ranked choice voting is if you are a member of a third party, if you're an independent, if you're an outsider, it gives you a little bit of extra voice. And it means that you are able to express your actual first choice at the ballot box, which is a great thing to be able to do without worrying that you're a spoiler or you're, voting for Ralph Nader in Florida in 2000 and electing George W. Bush. But it's also good for the major parties, I would argue, because they don't have to worry necessarily about those kind of 48% plurality victories. So they are able to campaign for the votes of those folks, and they're talking to them and they're listening to them. Go back to the main race in 2018, which was the first use of RCV in a congressional race in the country.
Yeah.
And you had Jared Golden up against Bruce Poliquin. Poliquin was the Republican incumbent. And there were 2 lefty independents in that race. And after the first round, Poliquin, the Republican incumbent, is ahead at 48%, and Golden has 46%, and the 2 Greens divided up the rest of the vote. In the old system, Poliquin goes on to win, even though a majority of voters wanted somebody else. Yep. Instead, with RCV, nobody had 50% after the first round, so Poliquin did not win. The second choices of the third and fourth candidates came into play, and Golden, the Democrat, goes ahead and wins that seat because he was campaigning. He was talking to those voters. And now he also knows that there's 7 or 8% of the voters in his district who are green leaning, who really care about those issues. And those voters were able to express that without having to worry that they were going to get somebody in Congress who is the exact opposite of what they were looking for.
Well, I want to move to Arizona, the Supreme Court, and we will likely want to come back to this. And the thing I'm going to ask in the future is going to be, what do we still need to figure out? And what is there anything the jury of the American populace we should still be attending to, thinking through about ranked choice voting? If you have a 30-second answer, give it. Otherwise, let's use that as a tease for next time.
Yeah, I think what we ought to be thinking about is how we use ranked choice voting in combination with multi-member districts to really fix gerrymandering and try to fix Congress. I think Don Byers' Fair Representation Act would be a great conversation in the future.
Good plug. All right, from your lips to God's ears, and I don't mean me. Next, Roberts Court is destroying voting rights. I didn't say that. You said that. Winning back state legislatures is the only answer. Again, I think you said that. Relative to the Supreme Court ruling on Arizona, we'll edit that and I'll say it like this. Based on, related to the Arizona voter suppression case. What happened in Arizona?
Well, what you had in Arizona was two laws that the Arizona legislature passes, having to do first with out of precinct voting, and second having to do with folks submitting absentee ballots for people who are not themselves, collecting ballots essentially in the vast native country of Arizona, where post offices can be really, really difficult to find, and mail service extraordinarily slow and unreliable. And those laws were challenged by Democrats, and that they won lower rulings because they demonstrated again and again that those laws had a pernicious and specific effect on Latino voters and Native American voters in Arizona. The U.S. Supreme Court disagreed, and they continued just squeezing what life remains out of the Voting Rights Act. You had a decision by Samuel Alito for a 6-3 court that essentially said there may have been some results here that was difficult for Latino or Native voters, but it was not enough to nullify the state's interest in being able to regulate its elections as they wish. And when you put this together with the court's decision in the Shelby County case back in 2013, that essentially eviscerated the preclearance provisions of Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, when you add that into Abbott versus Texas in 2018, that really increased the level of specific racial intent that you have to find in order to strike an election law down under the VRA. And now add this, which is going to really narrow the ability to show intent. It's going to really narrow down the ability to show results and effect, that many of these voter suppression laws that we are seeing enacted around the country right now, they might be able to survive under this pinched and cramped vision of the Voting Rights Act.
So the Alito standard, say again then how Alito wrote for the majority, how he then concluded that the law didn't violate the Voting Rights Act, basically by, to use your term, shrinking its ambit. Say more about how he did that.
Well, what Alito argues in his opinion is that 98% of Arizona voters didn't have any problem casting their ballot in the right precinct. So as a result, there was there was no real disparate impact. What the Democrats argued in court is that you had Latino, Black, and Native American voters who were twice or more than twice as likely to have their votes thrown out. And they focused on the fact that there is this, big difference between, if more than twice of those votes are being thrown out, that matters. And Alito is saying, no, you've got to assess the actual disparities in a rule's impact on members of different racial or ethnic groups. And then he also says you have to gauge the opportunities provided by a state's entire system of voting when you are assessing that burden, and then the strength of the state's interests that are served by that rule. Now, I would say that, you had 3.3 million votes that were cast in the presidential election in Arizona in 2020. If 98% of those votes were counted, that's about 3.23 million. The margin of victory for Donald Trump, the margin of victory for Joe Biden in the presidential race is only 10,000 votes in Arizona. So while to Justice Alito, that difference between 98% and 100 is not very much, the difference in actual votes there is more than 7 times the difference between the two presidential candidates. So there is clearly something really important at stake here.
What remains? What teeth still live in the mouth of the Voting Rights Act?
There's not much. It's really a shadow of what it has been. Section 2 certainly. I think a lot of observers feared that they would overturn it completely. Now you have this, 5-prong test that Alito has laid out in order to, make a Section 2 claim. It's going to be much, much more difficult. And I think that is something that all Americans ought to mourn. I mean, the Voting Rights Act is really the crown jewel of the legislation that came out of the civil rights movement. It's arguably the most effective civil rights legislation this country has ever had. It's what makes us a multiracial democracy. Before it was passed, in Mississippi, Black registration in 1965, it was 6%. After the Voting Rights Act, it jumps up to over 60. In Alabama, it was under 20%. After the VRA is enacted in 1965, it jumps up to over 50%. It's such a meaningful and purposeful piece of legislation. We see every day what's coming out of state legislatures in order to try to unwind it. We see how specifically and surgically race is able to be attacked and used in these laws that claim to be race neutral, even though they affect a very narrow set of people. And we need it more than ever. And this is the time that the Supreme Court is really draining all of its power away.
So there's an argument that it is not only, that the decline of the Voting Rights Act is not only a glitch of the modern movement that has been in ascendance for the last 40 years, but in fact a key feature that that essentially the Confederacy's revenge is the rise not only of Mitch McConnell from Kentucky and the rise of Barry Goldwater's brand of politics, which was in opposition to the Civil Rights Act, in opposition to Martin Luther King's Day being acknowledged, to now actually having the fruits of the Civil Rights Movement be torn from the tree. Is that an overstatement? Is that a misunderstanding of history?
No, I don't think it is. I think it's sadly true. What I would suggest has happened here is that conservatives decided to use the courts to unwind voting rights when they couldn't do so through the legislative or electoral process any longer. The Voting Rights Act is renewed almost unanimously in the United States Congress, in 1982, again in 2006, signed by Republican presidents, and yet behind the scenes, what you see, and there's a very young John Roberts in 1982, well before he is Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. He is a young aide working his first job in Washington at the Department of Justice. And he works very hard to lobby President Reagan to veto the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act back in 1982. Because, as he would argue in the Shelby County case, 25 years later, that the South has changed. He enunciates this theory of equal sovereignty to suggest that, states should not be held under preclearance and be held responsible for the wrongs of the past any longer. It's not 1964 in the South anymore, he argues, except they knew that they could not roll back the successes of the Voting Rights Act in the legislative process. In 1982, you have Trent Lott arguing against, a senator from Mississippi at the time, arguing against Roberts's perspective. And he goes to Reagan and he says, no, you've got to reauthorize the Voting Rights Act. Otherwise, all of us are going to be called racists. And conservatives knew they could no longer try to undercut this at the ballot box. If they were going to undercut it, it had to be done in the courts. And that's what John Roberts' legacy will be, that through Citizens United, through Shelby County, through Abbott v. Texas, now in the Brnovich case, and in Common Cause versus Rucho in the partisan gerrymandering case, they have squeezed the life out of the Voting Rights Act, and they have done everything they can to allow this moment in this country as we sort of slide toward a really dangerous and enduring minority rule.
All right, so bear with me for a moment. It's pop culture reference time. At Democracy Nerd, we're not merely nerds about democracy, we are in general, and that includes pop culture, etc. So there used to be a TV show on Comedy Central called Nathan For You. I think it's one of the greatest comedy shows of all time, for what it's worth, in which Nathan, the host, helped struggling businesses. Helped, I'll put in air quotes. In one episode, he was helping a small electronics store. They were having a hard time competing with Best Buy's low price match policy. So he suggested that the store sell TV sets for $1, which of course is very, very attractive. But in order to purchase said $1 TV set, the customer had to do some things. For one, they had to show up in full formal wear, tuxedos and gowns. They also had to crawl through a tiny door, and they had to get past a live alligator. If Nathan For You were in charge of the voting system in Arizona, and he set up maybe a slightly different, maybe exactly the same system, in order to be able to cast a ballot, would Samuel Alito use that same rationale? Would that pass muster, or would that be acceptable? Because assume you made it past live alligator, you would still be able to vote in equal measure as anyone else.
That's a great question. I feel like I should be a John Houseman in the paper chase here, and try to answer this hypothetical. But I think that's how voter suppression works, right? It's no longer go ahead and count all of the bubbles in this bar of soap. That's not what voter suppression is any longer. It is, well, do you have this specific form of ID? Did you sign your name exactly the way you signed your name when you registered to vote 30 years ago? Are you showing up at the right precinct to vote because we've moved this precinct in this neighborhood 3 times in the last 3 elections. Have we knocked you off of the ballot because you didn't vote in an election and then we sent a postcard to your house that looked like junk mail, and now you're going to get a provisional ballot instead? It's all of these little things that's not quite the same necessarily as crawling past a tiny door and getting past.
No, it's just not being allowed to have water given to you.
Right? I mean, we're going to send, 4 voting machines into the black neighborhoods in Atlanta. And so the line is going to be 7 hours long. And, we're going to make sure you can't have any water. So it's overcoming all of those barriers that is so difficult. And the reason why it matters is because in so many of these states, the election results are as close as they are. 44,000 votes in 3 states, in Wisconsin, in Arizona, and in Georgia, kept the Electoral College from being a 269 tie that the House would have given to Donald Trump because Republicans control more congressional delegations. So if you can keep skimming just a little bit, if you can keep trying to trip enough voters here and there, whether it's with an alligator or whether it's with a signature challenge or requiring a certain form of ID, you can maybe knock down 10,000. And Sam Alito says, hey, if 98% of the people have no problem, then it's no big deal. Except that 2% makes up the difference. And that 2% is disproportionately Black and Latino and Native American and voting Democrat. And the people who are making these rules know this.
It occurs to me, I brought up Nathan for you. I could have brought up Joe Rogan. He had his show. He's now, one of the biggest podcasts in the world. He's apparently an important thinker about how the world should work and a key voice to the youth of all ages. And he used to have Fear Factor, and you'd have people, instead of going past an alligator, have to eat some cockroaches. So, or we could just have it be stand outside for hours in suffocating heat, or publicly declare who they were voting for, or brave jeering mobs, or heck, sacrifice a day of work or instead of feeding your family, or something else that we couldn't possibly imagine would seem just absurd. Anything else you want to talk about on the Voting Rights Act or on the Supreme Court?
I think that's it.
Let's get to our third, redistricting and Elbridge Gerrymandering. The Guardian article: Republicans win the next election through redistricting alone. Actually, you said gerrymandering alone just this June, and in case you missed it, summer. What was the inconvenient truth that Ronnie Jackson told a group of religious conservatives last June? I think you talked about that.
Yeah, he showed up and he said the quiet part loud, right? He said Republicans control most of the redistricting process in most states around the country, and that alone should get us the majority back. He's not lying. He is spot on.
So how bad is it? I know for the last in the last election, Democrats have won significant majorities in the House and thin majorities in the House. This time, how much different is it?
Well, Democrats have got a 5-seat majority in the U.S. House. They could very easily lose 2 seats in Texas, 2 seats in Georgia, 2 seats in North Carolina, a seat in Florida, seats in Tennessee, Kansas, Nebraska, Missouri, New Hampshire, to Republican redistricting alone. So that's a dozen potential seats, perhaps even more, if Republicans try to aggressively crack blue cities and red states. Democrats going to have a really tough time making that up. Democrats historically, the party that holds power tends to do worse in the midterm elections anyway. So Democrats are going to have history against them, but they're also going to have the fact that Republicans are going to be redrawing all of these lines. Look, in the 2020 election, Democrats won 4.7 million more votes nationwide for the U.S. House than Republican candidates, but they only won a 5-seat majority. So what's entirely possible here is if those dozen seats shift If everybody votes exactly the same way as they did in 2020, under different lines, even a 4.7 million majority for the Democrats would not be enough to hold on to the U.S. House.
So what do we do about it? What is your, well, I want to pause on that question. Here's trivia time. Okay. Dun, 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 trivia time. And here's the thing. We should have somebody else come and quiz both of us, because my purpose is not really to put you on the spot. I would know the answer to this question only if and because it's in front of me and written by someone else. So I'm going to be the question asker, but I don't consider myself Alex Trebek, rest his soul, although I suspect he had the same advantage as I, as he didn't come up with the questions or the answers. But anyway, setting that aside, here's trivia time. Might you know, and you might, the last year in which Senate Republicans represented a majority of the country's population. To be clear, they have had a majority of seats in the U.S. Senate a lot of time, okay, including like many times. Do you know last time they actually represented a majority of the U.S. population?
Yeah, I know the answer to this only because I follow the brilliant Stephen Wolfe on nice. Twitter. And this might be the one podcast where Stephen Wolfe is a celebrity name that I can drop. And everybody knows exactly who he is. You're looking at, I believe, the 1996 to 1998 window.
Ding, 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 ding. 1996 is the year it says here, and the Google Doc is never wrong. Republican legislatures, they've got to be just salivating at the chance to use redistricting to entrench their, I'm going to use air quotes, majorities in Congress. The New Hampshire Republican chair said, quote, guarantee the state will send a conservative Republican to Washington, D.C. in 2022. Anything more we need to know about North Carolina? They lost 2 seats when a different map was drawn in 2020, when that map was a fair map. They have a Democratic governor, Roy Moore. Does the governor have to sign off on North Carolina's redistricting map?
Governor Cooper does not have to sign off on those maps at all. The Republicans will have complete control of that process. So you're absolutely right. The map that was upended by the state Supreme Court is an unconstitutional partisan gerrymander in 2019. You had a fair map in 2020, and Democrats immediately pick up 2 seats. Those districts can be kissed goodbye. You're going to go right back to a 10-3 map, and North Carolina also gains a seat after apportionment. So the question is going to be whether Republicans in North Carolina can draw themselves an 11-3 map and pick up 3 seats in North Carolina. It's entirely possible that they can.
The Google Doc is never wrong except for this once. I believe I said Roy Moore. The answer is Roy Cooper. Roy Moore is absolutely not the governor of North Carolina. North Carolina has Democratic Governor Roy Cooper. We can edit that however you so choose. 2 Atlanta area Democrats could be redistricted out of office. Getting back to the question fragment I put out before, do Democrats or even folks who just view themselves as majoritarians have any ability at this point to push back against the redistricting and yielding minority rule?
It's going to be extraordinarily difficult. I mean, what you just laid out when you asked the trivia question about the Senate, I think is at the core of this, right? We already have this deeply anti-majoritarian institution in the Senate. The House is trending in that direction. We have seen what has happened with the White House in that 2 elections since 2000 have gone to the loser of the national popular vote. We have seen that the loser of the national popular vote has since appointed 5 of the 9 justices on the U.S. Supreme Court, entrenching a conservative majority. And we've seen what's happened in state legislatures around the country. So in many ways, what we are looking at here is just this really dangerous spread of minority rule that it becomes very difficult for voters to do anything about at the ballot box. Democrats have this moment right now that they have complete control of Washington, and they could attempt to, enact a legislation, but a lot of it is running up against the filibuster. They do not seem to have the stomach to expand the U.S. Supreme Court or to add Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico as states, or to kind of do some of these important right-sizing moves that would be necessary to ensure, some sense of majority rule. And if they won't do that, even while Joe Biden warns that this is the moment in our democracy that reminds him most of the Civil War, he talks about how this is the greatest moment of threat to our democracy since the Civil War. If that's what you believe, then act like it.
This gets us to your book, Unrigged, How Americans Are Battling Back to Save Democracy. Why don't you tease that and how in our closing moments and how that links to today's conversation?
Yeah, I had written a book with the mom unfriendly title of Rat Fucked about partisan gerrymandering. And let me tell you, living in the world of partisan gerrymandering is depressing. If you think I've been depressing on here for the last 45 minutes, wait until you saw me talking about that book, and the double knot of unfairness that had been woven into our system. And what I really wanted to do was to cheer myself up, frankly. So I went around the country and I embedded with all of these amazing democracy movements and folks that were pushing back against these big, huge structural barriers that all of the experts said were too big, too hard, too stout. You can't possibly win that, not in that state, not on that issue. People's eyes glaze over, or that's a red state. I went out to Idaho and I rode in the Medicaid Express with these amazing activists that not only won Medicaid expansion in a bright red state, but they did so with more than 60% of the vote. Went down to Florida and rode along with Desmond Meade as they worked to end felony disenfranchisement in a state where this dated back to the actual Jim Crow era. And they won with 64% of the vote. I followed Katie Fahey out in Michigan as a millennial-led campaign.
Yeah, she's a friend of the show. We talked to her. We talked to her about the campaign. Yep.
They won independent redistricting in a state that's one of the most gerrymandered in the country. And it restored my faith that change is possible, because when you go out and when you see that voters in Idaho and voters in Florida and voters in Michigan and these red states and these purple states, they want a democracy that works for everyone. They still care about majority rule. They care about these issues. We knocked on a door in Idaho Falls, this deeply conservative Mormon town.
Yeah, I know it.
And there was a bumper sticker on the pickup truck as we walked up the driveway, and it said, "Vietnam, we were winning when I left." And I thought to myself, oh, hell, we're going to get our butts kicked at this door. We're going up here talking about Obamacare and Medicaid expansion.
Yep.
And the guy opens the door, and he looks like they were winning in Vietnam when he was there. I believe him. And he says, yeah, my kids fall into that same gap, and I know other people who are in that gap. I'm going to sign your petition and I'm going to vote for this. And, if that guy was driving down the highway and he had his turn signal on, I probably wouldn't let him in, right? But when you knock on the door and talk, you understand that you share some of the same issues and problems and concerns, and you can maybe find a way to do something about it together outside of the political process. And I felt like that was a really powerful moment.
Well, I want to say thank you so much for taking the time again. David Daley, the author of, well, I'm not going to say the name of that one, but I will say the name of Unrigged, How Americans Are Battling Back to Save Democracy. Thanks for catching us up this summer. Democracy's been on the menu. Thanks, folks, for trying to create a better one. And thank you for being with us, David.
Thank you. The show's so great. I appreciate it.
All right. Be well. Take care.